Welcome to the Explainer, everyone. Today, we're doing something really fascinating. We're essentially conducting a psychological autopsy on one of the most famous and, honestly, most complex murders in all of literature. We are stepping right into the dark, labyrinthine mind of Fyodor Dostoevsky's iconic protagonist from Crime and Punishment. We're not just looking at the how of this brutal crime, but diving deep into the deeply unsettling why. It's a question that's literally captivated readers for over a century, right? What could possibly drive a 23-year-old former law student to justify brutally killing two women? I mean, he wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't a mafia hitman. He was a bright, handsome, albeit impoverished intellectual. As he himself confessed, I was ambitious to become a Napoleon. That was why I committed the murder. So his motive wasn't just about survival. It was intertwined with this terrifyingly grand ambition. Okay, let's dive into this and map out our investigative path. We'll be looking at 1. The scene of the crime. 2. Surface motive, utilitarianism. 3. The extraordinary man theory. 4. The psychological reality. 5. The collapse of reason. And 6. The meaning of punishment. We're going to peel back the layers of this fascinating character. Let's start with part 1, the scene of the crime and a stifling environment. To really understand this crime, you have to look at the environment, because 19th century St. Petersburg is practically a co-conspirator here. Picture this. It's a stifling, intensely oppressive summer. The air is just thick with reeking fumes from countless local dram shops. Everywhere Raskolnikov looks, he sees desperate drunkards and profound urban poverty. And his own living situation? He's in this dingy, closet-like rented room, completely weighed down by crushing financial debt and literal starvation. This toxic, claustrophobic environment acts like a massive pressure cooker. It totally primed a hungry, alienated young man for some very extreme, dangerous thoughts. But we really have to ground all his lofty thoughts in the actual bloody reality of what happened. This wasn't some abstract thought experiment for him. Raskolnikov takes a hatchet and violently murders Alyona Ivanovna, an elderly, corrupt pawnbroker. But the grim reality of what he's done is magnified 1,000 times when Lizaveta, her innocent and pregnant sister, just happens to walk in. And without hesitation, he brutally murders her too. In that moment, the abstract becomes horribly, irreversibly real. Which brings us to part 2, surface motive and the utilitarian calculus. Now, what's really interesting about this is how he tries to justify the slaughter. He actually twists the ethical doctrine of utilitarianism, the idea that moral decisions should create the greatest good and happiness for the largest number of people. Dostoevsky is directly critiquing this philosophy. Raskolnikov looks at this wealthy, abusive pawnbroker and literally categorizes her as a louse, a creature harmful to society. He calculates that by killing her and taking her hoarded wealth, he could save dozens of starving families from ruin. He essentially tries to convince himself that one crime can be mathematically atoned for by 1,000 good deeds. And this dangerous math he's doing in his head, it's heavily fueled by nihilism, which was this massive cultural wave crashing over Russia in the 1850s. Basically, nihilists believed that all values are completely baseless and that existing institutions just need to be destroyed. It's a toxic mindset of tearing down the old without any plan for the new. It made it dangerously easy for him, or honestly, anyone looking to justify destructive behavior, to convince himself that stepping over the boundaries of traditional morality was not just acceptable, but necessary. Moving right along to part 3, the extraordinary man theory and the Napoleon complex. So that utilitarian argument we just talked about, that was mostly a mask. If we peel back the layers, we find his true intellectual motive, which actually comes straight from an article he wrote himself. Raskolnikov literally divides humanity into 2 distinct categories. On one side, you have ordinary men. In his mind, these people are conservative, obedient, and exist merely as biological material to reproduce and maintain the status quo. But on the other side, the extraordinary men. These are the creators, the transgressors. Think leaders like Napoleon or Newton. Raskolnikov arrogantly believes that these extraordinary men possess a natural inner right to shed blood and break old laws if it advances a new word for mankind. He asks himself, shall not one crime be effaced and atoned for 1,000 good deeds? For him, this whole murder wasn't just a desperate robbery for cash. No way. It was a philosophical test. He desperately wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't just an ordinary louse, but a superman, a Napoleon who was totally unbound by conventional human laws. He commits the murder just to see if he has the raw strength to step over that moral threshold without flinching. But here's where things start to unravel. Part 4, the psychological reality and a fractured mind. So, the crucial point is this. His grand theory demands cold, unfeeling execution. But if you look at the raw clinical truth of his condition, there is a massive disconnect. Break down the reality of his mind, and you find he is definitely not a cold, calculating Napoleon. Our sources show a clinical picture of a young guy who is highly introverted, avoidant, and socially anxious. We're talking about someone plagued by extreme schizophrenic tendencies. As the reality of what he's done sets in, he suffers from immense paranoia, delirium, and fever. He experiences deep dissociation, literally capable of both extreme cruelty and sudden, irrational acts of charity. But most importantly, driving all this madness, he's ultimately overwhelmed by a deeply ingrained human conscience. And that's something his nihilistic theories simply cannot erase. And that triggers part 5, the collapse of reason and the unbearable conscience. The brutal, visceral reality of the murder, especially accidentally killing the innocent Lizaveta, just completely shatters his grand philosophical theories. And Dostoevsky masterfully sets up a stark contrast to Raskolnikov's destructive intellectual pride here. Enter Sonia Marmeladov. Where Raskolnikov is arrogant, relies entirely on cold logic, and isolates himself, Sonia is humble, gentle, relies on faith, and is deeply connected to humanity. She was pushed into prostitution by crushing poverty to save her family from starvation, and yet she endures unimaginable humiliation with profound grace. She doesn't turn to nihilism or murder, she turns to self-sacrificing love. It's fascinating because these are two wildly divergent paths of dealing with suffering. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive turning point. When he falls to his knees and kisses Sonia's feet, he tells her, "I wasn't bowing down to you, I was bowing down to all human suffering." In Sonia, he suddenly recognizes the immense weight of humanity's pain. He realizes that his intellectual theories didn't elevate him above humanity like he thought. They just severed him from it. Her pure, self-sacrificing strength just entirely highlights the absolute failure of his rationalized violence. Which finally guides us into part 6, the meaning of punishment and redemption. So Raskolnikov's path to resurrection essentially requires the total destruction of his pride. It's a very specific path. It begins by confessing his crime to Sonia, who miraculously doesn't reject him, but embraces him. She actually reads him the biblical story of Lazarus, which totally foreshadows his own potential to rise from spiritual death. Then, she commands him to go to the crossroads and kiss the earth he has defiled, a public penance to reconnect him to the humanity he abandoned. Only after all that does he turn himself in to serve 8 years in a Siberian prison. And there, supported by Sonia's unwavering love, he finally achieves spiritual renewal. Dostoevsky's making an absolutely monumental statement here. Think about it. The legal system, the police, the Siberian labor camp, they're almost secondary. Raskolnikov's most agonizing punishment was never the actual Siberian prison. It was the crushing, feverish guilt inflicted by his own mind long before he was ever even arrested. True justice, as the sources reveal here, is achieved only through a genuine moral awakening. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. Dostoevsky showed us that, sure, you might escape the police and you might even be able to rationalize away society's laws with some brilliant, complex philosophy, but you cannot escape the deeply ingrained moral fabric of your own humanity. So what do you think? Does true punishment really come from the gavel of the law, or does it come from the inescapable prison of our own conscience? Thank you so much for learning with us today, and definitely keep asking the big questions.